Hey guys, in this video I'm going to show you how to turn this simple chest freezer into a kegerator, also known as a Keezer among some people. Alrighty, let's get into it. Alright guys, we picked up this chest freezer off Facebook Marketplace the other day for 80 bucks. And I feel like that's a pretty good deal considering the size of this chest freezer. Now, this is a 7.0 cubic foot chest freezer, and I think one of these retails brand new somewhere around $200 to $300. So by buying this thing used, we were able to save a little bit of money. Now, we have always wanted to build out a kegerator to have in this garage space so that we could serve beer on tap. I mean, how cool is that? So when we saw this deal on this chest freezer, we knew that this was the time to tackle this project. Now, before I can get to work on adding any of the components to actually make this thing a kegerator, oh, and by the way, just to let you guys know, I'll probably use the word kegerator and Keezer interchangeably. Now, Keezer is actually the word that a lot of people use when you turn a chest freezer into a kegerator, and so a lot of people use the word Keezer, but for some reason that word just feels really goofy to me, and for some reason I never really say it that much. I tend to say kegerator a lot more. So anyways, if you hear me say kegerator, just know that I mean the same thing. Kegerator, Keezer, they're pretty much the same thing. All it is turning something like a fridge or freezer into a place that you can put barrels to serve beer on tap. But anyways, back to this. So like I said, before we can do any of the work that it's going to take to actually turn this thing into a kegerator or Keezer, the first thing I have to do is I need to make this thing look a little bit nicer. You know, it's not terrible for one that's been used. Of course, there's a few little dents and dings on here. That's pretty typical for a chest freezer that's been used. I mean, these things tend to go in like basements or garage, and they kind of just seem to get abused over the years. So all things considered, this one's not bad. You know, I've definitely seen worse. So it shouldn't be quite as much work to get this thing looking nice. So one of the first things that I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a degreaser and get this thing completely cleaned off, just wipe it down and get it as clean as I can get it. Then I'd like to paint this thing just to, you know, spice this up a little bit. You know, the white, it's just not doing it for me. I am always a fan, if you've watched any of my videos before, you know I'm always a fan of adding color to this space. So I'm gonna paint this thing a nice color that's just gonna make it pop and stand out a little bit more and hopefully look a little bit better than this white, and just, you know, bring it back to life a little bit. So in order to get this thing painted, there's a little bit of extra prep work that I'll do, just because anytime you're painting something like these appliances, they have the super glossy, shiny surface, then you have to take a few extra steps to get the paint to adhere. So once I get this thing cleaned off, then I'll take my sander, probably with 220 grit sandpaper, and I'm just gonna sand over this entire thing to rough the surface up enough so that the primer and the paint will adhere to it. My hope is that if I take all of these extra steps to get the paint to adhere really well, then it won't flake off on me over the years, and hopefully it'll last for a really long time. Okay, so like I said, my first step is I've got to get all this gunk and grime off of here, so I'm gonna get to work on cleaning this up. Let me get to it. To get this freezer cleaned up, I broke out this crud cutter stuff in the garage and I gave it a good wipe down. For the areas that had a little more crud, I just used a non-scratch Scotch-Brite pad, and then I came back and sprayed the freezer down with some water to wipe away everything. Then I decided to go ahead and remove the top of the freezer to make that a little easier to clean. To remove it, I first had to remove the hinge cover, which was held on by one screw on the side of the hinge. Once that was removed, I could work on removing the 4 screws holding the spring-loaded hinges to the freezer. Once those screws were removed, the top came right off easily. This freezer really wasn't too terribly dirty, but I will say the one area that required a little extra cleaning was the rubber seal around the top. There was some mildew buildup that I wanted to try and remove, so for this stuff I used some bleach cleaner, which explains why I look like I'm about 2 steps away from being geared out in a full-on hazmat suit here. I'm very sensitive to bleach, so I had to throw on all the PPE for this step. To get rid of the mildew, I just sprayed the bleach cleaner on the area, and then I used my toothbrush to give it a good scrubbing. Now this worked pretty well, and after about 5 minutes, I had this top completely clean and it was sparkly white again. Just like my teeth have been for the last couple of weeks. It's the weirdest thing. Just kidding, I did throw that toothbrush away. Anyways, this freezer was mostly clean now, but there were a few last minute things that I wanted to take care of before I got this thing ready for paint. Prior to paint, I sanded the freezer with 220 grit sandpaper to rough it up enough so that it would accept the paint. Then I made sure to remove all the dust with a wet rag. I definitely needed to add some primer to this freezer first, so I applied about 2 coats of this Kills 2 primer. I was literally trying my best to make sure that this paint was going to stick to this freezer, so I definitely added more primer here than I would normally, especially since the paint that I'm going to be using has the primer already built into it. Speaking of paint, I went with this Valspar signature paint in this rad blue color that sort of reminded me of a retro appliance color. I don't know, maybe. Regardless, I think it was definitely going to be an upgrade from that white. With the freezer fully painted, my next step was to get a wooden collar piece made to attach to it. You'll see what the purpose of this is a little later on in the video. To make this collar, I just worked on milling some rough pieces of white oak that I had in my shop. Sure to stop every now and then just to make sure the foreman was nice and cool. I decided to make this wooden collar be 5.5 inches tall because I was trying to get 2 pieces out of an existing board. But you can really make this whatever size you want as long as it'll fit your hardware for your kegerator. I also decided to miter my corners here rather than doing butt joints simply because I like the cleaner look, but there are other less complicated ways to join this collar together if you choose. To get the collar assembled, I just used some Titebond 3 wood glue and slathered a little on the ends and then placed them together. Now, since trying to clamp angled pieces together can be a royal pain in the butt, I just used these metal corner brackets just to help hold everything together while the glue dried, and it just helped reinforce the corners a little bit more. Then it was time to cut the holes in my wooden collar for my taps. Now we currently only have 2 taps for beer, so I needed to cut out 2 holes here on the front of the collar. To do this, I clamped a scrap piece of wood to the back of the piece to limit tear out, and then I used a 7/8 inch spade bit to drill both holes. Finally, I gave this thing a good sanding and added a couple coats of finish. So I have my wooden collar built now for my kegerator. I just mitered the corners here, added some wood glue, and then came in with these corner brackets to help reinforce things and just sort of hold things together while the glue set up. Now this wooden collar piece is really important because it gives you a space that you can drill into for adding your taps rather than having to drill into the freezer itself. Now there's a lot of refrigerant lines in the freezer that you don't want to drill through, so this gives you the space that you can drill into for your taps. Now as you can see, I've gone ahead and drilled 2 holes here, and those are going to be for 2 eventual beer taps. I did leave a space here in the middle because we do want to eventually add some nitro coffee to this as well, and so whenever we get all the stuff for that, I'll drill another hole here in the middle. And then I think 3 6-till kegs is about probably the size limit for this size freezer. I haven't really tested that out, so I don't know for sure, but I think 3 is probably the most we would ever use at a time. So eventually there should be 3 holes here, but this is where I realized that I made a pretty big mistake. As you can see, I was just going for trying to get these spaced out to look good visually. However, I forgot that I planned on using this metal drip tray down here just to help catch some of those drips from the taps. However, by having these spaced so far apart, this one drip tray is not going to catch all of the drips for all of these taps. However, to fix this issue, I think rather than redoing this or flipping it around and drilling holes on the other side, I'm just going to buy another one of these, and then I'll put 2 of these together, and that should hopefully give me the width that I need to catch all of the drips from all 3 eventual taps. So now that I've got this together, the next step is just to get this actually attached to the freezer itself. To do that, I'm just going to lay down some silicone adhesive and then press this collar on top of that with some weight and let it dry, and then that should secure this really well to the freezer itself.
Once I had a good amount of weight on the top, then I wiped away as much of that silicone that squeezed out as I could. Then I left it alone for about 24 hours to dry. Then it was time to add some silicone to the inside of the freezer. I wanted to try and seal this thing up as good as I could so that it was as efficient as possible. So I spent some time adding silicone to any gaps that I saw. I also decided to add some foam insulation to the inside of the collar to again help with the efficiency of this thing. Now I planned on using 2-inch foam insulation board, but my local Lowe's didn't have any of this in stock when I went to pick it up, so I ended up going with 1-inch foam that I just doubled up to increase that R value. I took some of this tuck tape that I had to cover up those unsightly cut foam edges and just to help seal everything a little bit better. Something like foil tape might have been the better choice here, but I didn't have any of that, so I decided to give this tuck tape a try. It's supposed to be pretty moisture resistant, so I'm feeling confident that it might hold up just fine. Now it's time to work on adding some of the components that are going to turn this freezer into a kegerator. Now we bought a kit online from KegCo, which gave us most of the things that we would need to convert this freezer. It also came with some instructions on how to go about getting each piece installed. I started by attaching the faucet knob to the faucet, or tap as I refer to it sometimes. Then I connected the faucet to the provided shank and tightened everything together using the shank wrench which was provided with the kit. Lastly, I added the PVC spacer, and then I could insert these into the holes that I drilled on my wooden collar. With my taps placed in the holes, I installed a shank nut from the back side and tightened. Now because of all my foam, this made it more difficult to get it fully tightened, but I think it was good enough. I might eventually come back and remove a section of that foam around the taps so I can tighten these even better, but that's a task for another day. Then it was time to install my temperature controller. Now, since this is a freezer and I don't want it to do what it's designed to do, freeze, I'm going to use this temperature controller to, yep, you guessed it, control the temperature. The one I'm installing is the Inkbird ITC 308, and I got it off Amazon for about 35 bucks. I just mounted this on one of the sides, and then I drilled a hole to run the temperature sensor through and then sealed off the hole from the inside. Then I took that temperature sensor and I wrapped it in a little bit of that tuck tape. The thing is, I'm not sure if this thing is waterproof or not. A lot of the info I found online said it was, but I added some of this tape as a little extra security. I then placed the sensor inside of a bottle of water that I would keep inside the freezer. This will hopefully give me a more accurate reading since it's measuring the temperature of liquid rather than the air inside the freezer. To operate the temperature controller, I plugged the provided plug for the temperature controller into the wall outlet, and then I plugged the electrical plug from the freezer into the separate attached outlet that gives an option for heating or cooling. I obviously plugged it into the cooling one. Now, everything is going to automatically show up in Celsius, so if you need to change it to Fahrenheit, then you will have to make some adjustments in the settings. Honestly, I would not even recommend using the instructions. They're pretty terrible. Just look up how to do it on YouTube. Once you have it set, you can set it to the temperature you want it to be. Now, I set mine to 34 degrees Fahrenheit, so once it reaches that temperature, it should keep it right around there for some nice cold brewskis. Finally, I could get the top reinstalled and work on getting this thing set up in its new home. To get the top attached, all I had to do was reinstall those spring-loaded hinges, this time into my new wooden collar with the screws I previously removed. This kegerator was really starting to look and function like I hoped it would. However, a kegerator isn't much of a kegerator without some beer, right? So we headed out in search of some. We ended up heading to one of our favorite local breweries to pick up a 6-still keg of one of their hazy IPAs, which just so happens to be one of my favorite types of beer at the moment, so I was eager to get this thing home and get it hooked up. To get this kegerator operational, the first thing we did was connect the air line to the CO2 regulator. We just pushed the rubber tubing over the end of the regulator and fastened it tight with a little plastic clamp. Then we attached one end of the beer line to the top of the coupler that will attach to the keg. Now, just as a side note, I'm pretty sure we didn't follow the instructions in the exact order for attaching all of these lines, but they all got attached eventually, so I think we good. Next up, we attached the CO2 regulator to the CO2 tank. Now, we did have to purchase the CO2 tank separately from the kit that we bought from KegCo. The tanks do come empty, and we were able to get it filled from a local welding supply store. Once everything was snugly attached, we placed the CO2 tank with the attached regulator inside of the freezer. Then we attach the other end of that air line to the coupler that will attach to the top of the keg, and we tighten it down with that same style of clamp. Then we attached the other end of the beer line to the shank for the faucets and clamped it tight. Now, they do recommend placing these tubes into some hot water just to make them bend a little bit easier. We didn't do that, as you can see. Next, we remove the cap from the top of the keg and attach the coupler by rotating it until it stopped, and then pulled down the handle until it clicked. Finally, we opened up the regulator valve and then opened up the valve on the CO2 tank and adjusted the CO2 pressure until it read between 10 and 12 psi. Now the kegerator was ready to rock, but there was still one more thing to do before we could get to pouring beer. I wanted to attach these drip trays to the front to catch some of the drips from the taps. In order to get these attached, I used a combo of some bolts, nuts, and washers to attach some rare earth magnets to these drip trays. The magnets should hold these trays on the front, and they can be easily removed to be cleaned. And with that, I think this kegerator is finally ready for its inaugural pour.
Alright guys, that is a wrap on this kegerator build. Now this was a pretty quick and fun project for me, and to be honest, when I started this project, I had no idea what I was doing, but to look at it now, I have to say that I think this thing turned out really cool. And I have a feeling that it's gonna get a fair amount of use in our household. I hope you guys enjoyed watching this video. If you did, consider giving it a like for me just to help my channel continue to grow, and maybe get subscribed too, because you never know what type of project I'm gonna tackle next. And if you don't wanna miss out, get subscribed. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I'll see you guys again soon for my next build. Cheers.